Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, a review of key changes to the new USDA Pediatric Feeding Guidelines and extended Q&A with Dr. Wendy Sue Swanson and Dr. Carina Venter. I'm Leslie Samay, Director of Professional Development at Great Valley Publishing, the publishers of today's Dietitian magazine, and I'm your moderator for today's show. Today's complimentary webinar is brought to you with support from Spoonful One, the most complete way to introduce and keep food allergens in a baby's diet. Spoonful One products contain 16 food allergens covering over 90% of food allergies, making it easier for parents to follow the new USDA guidelines and routinely feed common allergens to kids. Visit spoonful1.com to learn more. Today's not-for-credit Q&A session is a result of the incredible number of questions that were received during the original live webinar that took place last year on December 2nd, 2021. Today's presenters will spend some time discussing the most commonly asked questions from that webinar, and then we'll open it up to live Q&A from our listeners on today's show. Throughout the presentation, if you have a question, please type it in your question box in your control panel. We'll try to address as many questions as time allows. This broadcast is being recorded and will be available on today's Dietitian CE Learning Library for you to come back to again and again. So with that, let's get started. Today's presenters have the following relevant disclosures to report. Wendy Sue Swanson, MD, MBE, FAAP, is a Spoonful One stock shareholder and has received speaking honoraria from the Lee Bureau. Carina Venter, PhD, RD, has received grants and research support from Reckitt and the National Peanut Board and honoraria as a speaker and consultant for Nestle Nutrition Institute, Danone, Reckitt, Abbott Nutrition, Before Brands, Else Nutrition, and Sifter. Both speakers certify that no conflict of interest exists for this program. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Wendy Sue Swanson, a pediatrician and chief medical officer for Spoonful One, and Dr. Carina Venter, an associate professor of pediatrics, allergy, and immunology at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Great to be here. This is Dr. Wendy Sue Swanson, and Dr. Venter is there too, as you just heard. So I think we'll just, again, we wanted to follow up. We had so many questions back 2 months ago in the education session that we had, and I feel so grateful for the questions and being able to have a chance to go over that. Here you'll see on the slide, we wanted to, at the top, just review the overarching new guidelines from the USDA that really do align with the consensus statements from the North American Society of Allergy groups, but also go a step farther in some ways to help nutritionists and dietitians like yourself, pediatricians, family doctors, gastroenterologists, all of those providers in a family's life that help guide and think, help parents think through how they want to feed their babies. And, I love the tagline from the USDA this year, make every bite count. The reality that, as babies transition to complementary and solid foods around 6 months of age, that making sure each one of those bites or each one of the offerings through those early months and years are really thoughtful in what they do in help growing a child. So number one, of course, recommendations continue to recommend exclusive breastfeeding at least until 4 months. Many providers like to continue exclusive breastfeeding until 6 months. And as you all know, we often recommend 400 international units of vitamin D. And then when baby and when mom both show signs of readiness at 4 to 6 months, number two, right, that you introduce complementary foods. But not just that we go for fruits and vegetable and say cereals, but that we go into number three and we really think about diet diversity. Without question, pediatricians like me and nutritionists and allergists certainly guided families away with caution from foods that are known to be common allergens, and they talked about really the introduction of food to go really slowly. And what we, of course, recognize and realize with groundbreaking research in the last 5 to 10 years is that serves a disservice to a child, and specifically to an infant and toddler when the immune system is developing. And Dr. Venter here, has done some of the groundbreaking research around the world on how the benefit of diet diversity, even in infants as young as 6 months, affords a less allergic lifetime, even out to 10 years thereafter. The USDA reflects that here by saying that diet diversity is important and has many benefits. So, of course, as you're guiding pediatricians and moms and dads and hospital systems on how to start foods, moms and dads can start one food at a time, but they really don't want to go too slowly, since the biggest goal really is that complementary diet diversity really early in life. further the USDA goes and articulates more about portion sizes, recognizing that some babies just don't take in a lot of different bites and things in the beginning, and thinking carefully about that. And then number 5 is the key one with this introducing common allergens. So not just thinking about peanut, not just thinking about egg, even though around the world, the most convincing data on early feeding has come out of those 2 foods, that the USDA recognizes that the immune system has a universal way of learning about food. So don't just think about peanut and egg, but think about all the common allergens. So tree nuts, soy, dairy products, fish, shellfish, all of those different common allergens, making sure that families feel comfortable that it's safe to introduce all those foods in early life. And then, of course, lastly, a constant reminder that we have during infancy, we don't recommend fruit juice because of that high caloric density and that preferential, motivator that it can have for kids to have a sweet tooth and craving, but to think on, of course, supplementary water only after 6 months, iron fortified formula or breast milk as the common really ground, to what a baby is drinking. Carina, do you have anything else to add to that from the USDA guidelines?
No, I think, you've really summarized it well. Main changes is we can introduce complementary foods from 4 to 6 months. Diet diversity is important. That counts for food as well as allergens. Once we start weaning, no need to delay the allergenic foods.
Yeah, thank you. So we'll move on. And now, this session, of course, is really directed at questions that we received. I mean, we received well over 100 questions in the last webinar that we did, and Dr. Venter and I did our best to get through them. But what we did is we broke them up into 7 different categories, and we're going to go through those for the next about 20 or 25 minutes, where we'll just answer the common questions that we heard from the webinar back in December, and then we'll kind of open up the mic and answer questions in live time for the second half of the hour. So as we're communicating and as we're answering on these different categories here with the table of content, don't be shy. I mean, continue to ask deeper probing questions or questions we didn't really clarify to the degree that maybe you want them to be. And then what we'll do is in the second half of the session, we'll go back and answer more questions that you're asking here in live time today. So just first introducing allergens, then we'll talk about breastfeeding and allergen feeding. Then we'll move on to safety and the allergen introduction category. So as you heard at the top of the hour, I work with Spoonful One. There are a number of other different complementary companies, really just trying to make it easy for families to get allergens in regularly. We'll talk about cow's milk protein allergy in the context of introduction. We'll also talk about food allergy risk factors. So what do you do with families who are increasingly concerned because they have family history, et cetera? And then going beyond the USDA guidelines, we'll talk a little bit about some questions we got about allergy guidelines, the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines, et cetera. And then lastly, very hot topic, as you guys all know, baby-led weaning and allergen feeding. And just Dr. Venter and I will give some thoughts about that in regards to questions that we received. So first topic here, we'll start really right out of the gate here. Carina, I think, is going to answer the first question. I'll read it. Does a single food need to be introduced at a time? So that idea of can families only introduce single foods? And do we need to wait 3 days in a row before moving on to the next one?
Okay, so yeah, let's start with that. As you've already heard from Dr. Swanson, diet diversity in early life is important. We now have published data from Asia, Europe, and the United Kingdom showing that food diversity at 6 and 12 months is associated with less food allergy by 2, 6, and 10 years. So I think, really nice to have this international data. But often when I quote this data, and my own research is part of that, people say to me, but the American Academy of Pediatrics still recommends that we should wait 3 to 5 days between every new food. So I want you to be aware that in 2019, the AAP published a book, Caring for Your Baby and Young Child, and they state in the book, in the past, pediatricians recommended starting 1 new food every few days, so that you can see if a reaction occurs to that particular food. New research has shown that it is safe to start multiple foods at once. And just to do a little bit of math here, if we do start introducing by 6 months of age and we wait 3 to 4 days between every new food, we will get only 45 foods in. If we do a new food every day, that could be 180 days. So it definitely affects diversity by waiting 2 to 3 days between every new food. I don't know, Wendy, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I started into pediatric practice in general pediatrics back in 2006, and I remember giving the advice to go really slow and watch foods and wait in between. And I do think it's really easy advice to give. What we know today, though, of course, is it's the wrong advice, right? That it led families both to medicalize feeding in a way that I think was unnatural in some ways and uncomfortable. And we provoked a lot of fear. And there was no data in the academic literature that backed up the recommendation that you needed multiple days between feedings. I mean, I think philosophically, when I was trained as a pediatrician, it was kind of like, oh yeah, you feed and you might have a reaction on the second feeding. That's possible, but the real science behind it is that if you don't see a reaction after feeding within 2 hours, it's very unlikely that you'll have the diagnosis of an IgE-mediated food allergy. So you can guide families to say a better way to think on this is if you want to go cautiously and you want a lot of control, introduce a new food every day. To Carina's point, I mean, you never want to go where you're only going to get 45 foods in. I mean, so think on a, in an ideal world, you go from a liquid diet at 6 months of age to a pretty complementary and solid food majorly diet at 12 months. And through that 6 month traverse, if you were introducing a new food that the family loved and enjoyed and thinking carefully, you'd have this huge bouquet of diversity. So that's why I love the new recommendations to think, do it however you'd like. You can put multiple foods together if families feel comfortable. If they don't and they want to do single foods to build confidence in themselves as parents and watching their babies as they eat, then it's just ideally one new food every day, and just to the USDA guidelines, making sure that that is not just fruits and veggies and cereals, but it also includes protein sources like fish and shellfish, things like tree nut butters, things, that include all this different food diversity. And the next question, go ahead.
Wendy, just getting back to the dietary guidelines, if it's a breastfed baby, remember that the grains ideally need to be fortified with iron.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And some folk, you all know this more than me as a pediatrician, but, we also will sometimes in exclusively breastfed babies after 4 months recommend iron fortification if it's difficult for mom and baby in combination to get all those complementary iron fortified foods in. So the second question here, so when and for whom is it appropriate that, a mom and baby or dad and baby go to an MD to introduce a food? Bottom line on this is that there's no strict recommendation for any baby. That being said, as we know, the number one risk factor for developing, an IgE-mediated food allergy is severe eczema. That is the number one risk factor. It's not genetics as the number one risk factor. It's truly the condition of a child's skin. And that's because we know kids with eczema are more likely to sensitize in early life to foods because they're in the environment and they get exposed to the skin. So if a child has a diagnosis of severe eczema, I often recommend, and we recommend from the North American guidelines and also the AAP, that they talk with their pediatrician for a plan. Most babies, thankfully, if they're introducing things like peanut or egg or tree nuts in early life, won't have a reaction. So most pediatricians are comfortable with mom and baby or dad and baby feeding those foods at home. However, it's always really wise, of course, to listen to the combination of fear and anxiety and risk. If there's a strong family history and a child has severe eczema, and maybe mom and dad have an older child with an allergy and they're just so anxious, then that's when we offer a first-time feeding in the presence of usually a pediatric allergist. The goal, of course, at that point is to build confidence with mom and dad that there wouldn't be a reaction, and then if there were a reaction, that they could intervene. So you can certainly guide families to talk with their pediatrician in the case of severe eczema. Now, if a well baby, a child who does not have severe eczema or even just has mild eczema, even in the case of a family history, even in the case of a sibling with an allergy, it is not standard of care to have that baby introduce a food in the presence of a doctor. That being said, if mom and dad are too anxious, of course, what we want to do is offer them comfort, because the last thing we want to do is have them be so scared about the introduction that they don't get it done, right? That's the big risk. The risk is not typically in introduction of foods at 4 to 6 months of age or even 6 to 9 months of age. The risk is in delay. It's kind of like missing the moment. So in a case where you find a family who's highly anxious, I do everything in your work as an advocate to get them in front of a clinician to eat those foods in the presence, of a healthcare environment where they feel safe, so that they can move forward and introduce all those allergens, or foods that are commonly known as allergens. Okay, I think we'll move on to the next topic. This next slide just goes over 2 more common questions that we got again back in December. And these, of course, are about breastfeeding and allergy feeding. And so Dr. Venter is going to take the first question.
So that's an easy one to answer. Every single food allergy prevention guideline in the world state that there is no reason for mothers to avoid any of the food allergens while pregnant or breastfeeding. So, there's no need to avoid any allergenic foods because you want your child to be free from food allergy. I think that's a very important message to get across. Whether they should consume the allergens, that's a different story. I don't think we have enough data to say that a vegan mom absolutely must include egg in her diet or milk in her diet during pregnancy or breastfeeding. But it is, if she's on a normal diet, or if she particularly likes consuming some of the allergens, and Dr. Swanson already listed the allergens out for you, then please continue to do so. Do not start with any avoidance measures. I don't know, Wendy, if you wanted to add anything to that.
No, I think that's great. I mean, you bring up the question of the vegan mom and a restrictive diet. And, recently there was this mom on TikTok who got, I know that sounds ridiculous, but she got national attention. And I interviewed with Good Morning America about this issue on vegan babies even, right? And, there's an AAP guideline that can, that states how we support families who are trying to raise their children in a plant-based diet. And I just want to say I enthusiastically want to support that kind, as so many of us do. And yet I do think allergens might be the one, thing to really think carefully about because of how the immune system's developing. So I know this isn't necessarily about breastfeeding per se, but, Carina, you've done some of the work on the science of what's going through breast milk, but we do know that there's a benefit to having these foods in the GI tract in infants in early life, meaning that if a child is being raised vegan, they'll miss out potentially on the ability of the immune system to just get used to things like fish or shellfish, even egg or dairy products. There's great data from around the world that feeding cooked egg, baked egg, into an infant's diet does tend to have a protective effect against the development of allergy to egg. So in that case, I think it might be a category where if mom and dad are raising a baby vegan, that's where actually I do think the complementary allergen reduction products might be a really good add-in to their vegan diet through a period of development, say, 6 months to 18 months of life, and then they can probably step away from it. The hope is that the immune system really learns and is tolerized. Next question is really, Carina, sorry, do you want to add something on veganism? Or?
Yeah. I think that's important distinguish to make. I was talking about the mom during pregnancy and breastfeeding. I think for the infant, or I know for the infant, the data is very good to say that really, ideally, they should be consuming the allergens. And so clinically, we actually will have a very clear discussion with the family, show them all the evidence, and then finally let them make the decision about the introduction of allergens. But I think there's much more data in infancy to really make such a conversation important and necessary than perhaps what we know about the diet during pregnancy and breastfeeding.
Yeah, I think that's a great distinction. There's something about a baby's GI tract. We know about 70% of the immune cells in the immune system is providing surveillance in the GI tract. Think about it. So it's like it's in the lymph system, it's in the blood system, but 70% of those cells are in the GI tract. And so that direct exposure to those proteins can be really powerful in early life. The next question, what are your thoughts about AAP guidelines of exclusive breast milk until 6 months? Now, this is so complicated, and you guys all know this because it gets really political and difficult, but it kind of depends on which committee you're recommending and talking to. As we all know, the WHO recommends around the world exclusive breastfeeding until 6 months of age. And that being said, different committees from nutrition to obesity to the section of allergy and immunology, et cetera, from the American Academy of Pediatrics say sometimes a little bit different things. And that is that we know we don't want any complementary foods before 4 months of age. And yet we know some babies show lots of signs of readiness between 4 and 6 months. And I think of anything I've learned from, in my role in the last 4 years, I like Carina. Carina's really considered a global expert. And I've had the privilege of talking to immunologists and allergists all over the world. Everybody believes that the earlier you get this diet diversity in, the earlier you get these exposure in, likely the better for babies. So in some ways, I just like to say, if mom is ready and if baby shows signs of readiness, then when, developmentally appropriate, I think starting some complementary foods with intention for this immune protection can be beneficial. But also to be very clear, if mom is really interested in exclusive breastfeeding until 6 months of age, there's no data that says you need to do this between 4 to 6 months. So I really want to honor mom and baby's preferences in that way and honor the reality that there isn't anything that says you have to start earlier. It's just that, the insights that I've really received from these world-leading immunologists is that the earlier the better. So I want families to just feel a sense of freedom and a sense, of intent to just really get going early when they can. Carina, anything else that you want to say about that?
No, I think you explained that very clearly, and particularly the point, if mom and baby aren't ready to start weaning or introducing solids till 6 months of age, then there's no evidence to force the issue. So, but if they are ready, then there's good evidence to say, let's get the foods in and let's get the diet diverse.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, moving on to safety, and I'll take a number of these questions. And Carina, I'll ask for you to chime in. So, what are the signs and symptoms a parent should look for when introducing allergens, and what's the protocol they should follow if they notice symptoms? So, again, I just want to overarching. It is very safe to feed babies common allergens in early life. It is not safe to delay them, right, because of this critical period. That being said, we live in a somewhat allergic population with 6 million children in the United States with food allergies, and that means 8% of children. Now, not 8% of infants per se. We certainly know that there's a preponderance when you look at infancy, in part because I think of how we introduce foods. We know most common allergens in infancy are peanut, milk, and egg. So those are 3 foods that, if you're thinking carefully with a family who maybe is very nervous, you could say, well, the foods you might want to think on in the introduction are, you're going to use maybe an introduction of dairy or introduction of egg and introduction of peanut, and watching babies for a couple of hours after that is the safest way to go. So a small serving of any one of those foods is appropriate. And if you were to see signs and symptoms of an allergic reaction, again, by definition, you will see them within the first 2 or even just 3 hours. If more than 2 or 3 hours goes by and a baby vomits or a baby has a symptom, it's probably not related to the feed, or it's certainly not related to an allergic reaction in general. The 2 most common symptoms of an allergic reaction in infants and toddlers are hives. They're the number 1 symptom in over 80% of the cases. You tend to see hives. Now, those can be localized to the face, or they can be systemic and they can go through the bloodstream, and you can see splotches all over the baby's body. Now, that's different than a diaper rash, and it's different than redness around the mouth. Hives are raised up. So if you have your eyes closed, you can rub your fingers over hives and you can feel them. And on visual inspection, they look a little bit like a fried egg. So they have a center that's a little bit light colored and then a red ring kind of around them. And moms and dads will see them within minutes after feeding if a child has already developed an IgE-mediated reaction. And the second most common symptom that you see in infancy and then into toddlerhood is vomiting. And again, vomiting within minutes or about 2 hours of feeding. And sometimes families will say, oh yeah, I fed them a little baked something, and oh yeah, they vomited, and then I fed them some scrambled eggs, and then they vomited right away. And they'll kind of say like, oh, it just dawned on me, it wasn't just vomiting, it maybe was associated with the egg, for example, something like that. Now, the number 1 thing they should do is look at their baby. They can call their pediatrician for support if needed. If a baby's over the age of 6 months, they could administer something like Benadryl, and sometimes in the experience of hives, a baby will be much more comfortable with that. In the case of vomiting, they just want to discontinue, watch for signs of hydration, etc. In the very rare case that a child would have more symptoms, which is again extremely rare in infancy, where mom was worried or dad was worried about wheezing, difficulty breathing, significant swelling in their mouth or anything, then of course mom and dad would always be recommended to dial 911 and get emergent support. That being said, again, it's extremely rare in infancy and toddlerhood that we see any signs and symptoms of severe life-threatening allergic reactions, thank goodness. Carina, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think, you've summarized that really well. We rarely see severe symptoms in the young infants, but that's also, once again, an important reason to get it in younger rather than in older infants.
Yeah, that's right. And, it's almost like there's something about the way the immune system's evolved to really tolerate this at infancy. And that's why I just love being really, intentional about saying a new food right away, right in the beginning, that, we do see more significant and severe reactions as children age. And of course, the most dangerous time for a child with food allergies can be much later in times like adolescence.
Yeah.
So when would you do an allergy consultation and when is it warranted? It's a difficult question just out of the box, but number one, if you're working with a family or working with a team caring for a child, if the child had significant, almost immediate reactions, or again, within that, 10 minutes or 2-hour time frame, and specifically if it ever happened more than once to the same food, for example, without question, I would have that family evaluated by an allergist. There are routine tests that can be done in the skin and also blood tests that then are correlated with a child's experience and the medical history. There's always a worry of overdiagnosis and concern in that. I'll just point out that, and Carina, please chime in after this, but one of the frustrating parts about the science of allergy is that, the blood levels, for example, when you draw what's called a RAS test, can sometimes in a child look high, and then you're like, but this child eats wheat fine. And vice versa. Sometimes they'll be lower and a child doesn't tolerate a food and vomits or has hives immediately on feeding. So there's not a perfect correlation with the testing. So making sure that people don't over-test is, of course, always something we want to do, and that a family is working really carefully with smart pediatric allergists to not over-restrict the diet based on concerns and fears. As we know, this is this time in life that you want to optimize it. So even if a child had even a little like what we would call a sensitization to food, not hives, not vomiting, maybe another symptom. A lot of nutritionists and pediatric allergists will actually encourage feeding through that because there's likely a way that a family can keep developing tolerance to those foods. That, the science on feeding is that overall kind of, repeated feeding of these early allergens in life is what boosts or either maintains tolerance. It's not just that you introduce a food once in early life and you're done. It's that you get a food in over and over and over again, and that diet diversity that tends to kind of tone down the immune system that way. I'm going to clip along because we're already at 27 after the hour, so I'm going to keep going. So what are some red flags that a parent should stop offering allergy food? Same thing, hives, vomiting, any reaction a family feels uncomfortable with, stop feeding that food, talk with their pediatrician, and inquire about allergy testing. And then lastly, does the controversy about high content of heavy metals in commercial baby foods impact the introduction of baby foods? Carina, do you want to take that first, and then I'll add in some thoughts I have?
Yes. So first of all, I don't routinely do that with baby food, but most definitely when I use plant-based milk in older infants, I would contact the company and ask for their certificate of testing for all these different heavy metals. I know there's been a lot of press about, heavy metals such as lead, mercury, and cadmium in baby food. And when parents ask me about that, I normally say to them that I do not recommend the use of commercial baby food every day for reasons other than the lead content. Commercial baby foods are sterile by definition. If you mash up your own banana, or if you make your own applesauce or puree your own apple, it contains some natural bacteria, which we call the natural bacterial load, which is very beneficial for the infant's gut. So I think at the end of the day, it's all about balance. Cook when you can, make your own baby food when you can, use commercial baby foods when you're out and about and traveling, but don't use it every day, 3 times a day. And I'll just briefly say that I've published a paper where we tested the pH of commercial baby foods, particularly the one in pouches. They have a very low pH, which may explain some of the damage we see in children's esophagus, particularly those that go on to develop eosinophilic esophagitis. So in short, cook when you can, commercial food when needed, but not every day and all the time.
Yeah, thank you, Carina. I mean, I love that advice. It can be so overwhelming for families who are under-resourced or working a lot to So I think it's always just a balance to encourage families to just share their food with their babies. I mean, that's the other thing, that it doesn't have to be so elaborate that baby eats something so separate from family meals. I think once, when you have an appropriate texture, like all the food diversity that you've got in your chicken soup is likely great for your baby too. And so just encouraging families to share their family foods in appropriate textures is a good way forward. And lastly, about the, heavy metal contamination, FDA is reviewing new regulations and guidelines. And we at Spoonful One, for example, we're a pediatrician founded company. We have always checked for heavy metals at every stage of sourcing our ingredients after all of our finished goods. And I think we should all advocate absolutely in anything commercially prepared for infants, higher and higher standards, since we know, just like the critical immune development, there's critical, neurodevelopment occurring during those years too. And we know heavy metals can be more dangerous to an infant because of their body surface, area ratio, but also because of the really critical period during their neurocognitive development. Okay, moving on. I know we're a little behind, but I know we see questions coming through too, so don't worry, we're going to get to your questions, and we just have a few more slides of these questions from the past session. So Carina, this is, I'm going to let you take the lead here on how to get cow's milk, how to get dairy basically into an infant's diet. What are your recommendations?
Yes, this is a very topical question. At the moment, on Friday, I gave a lecture in 3 different countries in Europe, and very different topics. And each and every time I was asked, how do you introduce cow's milk protein in young infants? This is also a topic we've debated on a randomized controlled trial I'm currently involved in. I would say that my short answer would be that yogurt would be my preferred way to get it in. Just remember that Greek yogurt or strained yogurt have got a very high amount of protein. They can contain up to 3 grams of protein per ounce of yogurt. I get asked the question whether it should be live or bio yogurt. I've read a lot about the topic. There may be somebody here from the dairy industry that would like to comment in the question section. But for most, I normally say to my patients or study participants that we ideally would like to have a live yogurt. Having said that, the one particular bacteria that's been studied in all allergy prevention studies is not available in yogurt. So it's a very non-specific advice to give to say go for bio or live yogurts. But that would be my preferred option. Some mothers that want to breastfeed but definitely don't want to give a bottle, don't want to give yogurt, they may use a teaspoon of, infant formula already made up with water. Cheese, definitely not my preference because of the high salt content until they're a little bit older.
I just learned a lot there. That was great, Dr. Venter. That was great. Cheese, that's so interesting about the salt. I love cheese, but I have such a salt tooth, and I think I created a salt tooth in one of my babies, and maybe part of it was cheese that we certainly used during those early years. So that's super helpful. Would you still introduce cow's milk protein to an infant on a specialized formula due to not tolerating standard milk-based formula? Carina, do you want to start with that?
I wouldn't do that because here we're not talking prevention. We are clearly talking to a child that's got a reaction to a standard milk-based formula, and the milk protein is the trigger of the reaction. So in that case, I will not give any cow's milk or yogurt, other cow's milk containing food. But where our practice have changed, knowing that we know so much more about the immune system and the fact that the immune system really wants these allergens, is that our time of follow-up before we consider reintroduction of cow's milk at home, if it's safe, or performing an oral food challenge in hospital in other cases, it's much shorter. We would now bring children back 3 months, 6 months after diagnosis, whereas previously we would have left them for 2 years. So I say be proactive in trying to find out if the child's outgrown the allergy so that we can get the milk proteins back in the diet on a regular basis.
Yeah, and one comment on that, there's a spectrum with true cow's milk protein allergy and cow's milk protein intolerance, et cetera. And, in things like Spoonful One, for example, or other introduction products, sometimes they have a very small amount of baked milk in there or dairy that you potentially a child would tolerate very easily. The one exclusion to that is a condition called FPIES that you've likely heard about. that's an absolute, no-no on any of foods that there's suspected FPIES reaction to. But many kids who have a cow's milk protein intolerance that's identified either from, from the formula feeding or from bloody stools or even fussiness and mom and dad remove dairy will tolerate very small amounts. So sometimes it's a spectrum. So again, talking with the pediatrician to clarify that might then allow for that cow's milk protein to be exposed into the baby's tummy in that early life and not miss the benefit of that early feeding from a protection standpoint. I think we can move on. The next group of questions, just from a risk factor standpoint. So lots of questions about this in our previous session, and certainly lots that we can answer. Carina, why don't you take the first question?
Perhaps, Wendy Sue, we should just go to the one or two of the questions that the audience have asked before we go to the risk factor slide. So one of the foods, one of the questions that was asked is, what should be the first foods to cultivate the gut? I heard baby cereal isn't recommended. So that's a very interesting question and sort of like comment. So first of all, I would say that definitely the dietary guidelines recommend that infants should have cereal, and it should be iron fortified cereal. Now let's talk about the gut. The gut definitely likes diversity, particularly diversity of plant-based foods. And so I would say that if you can get, different grains in, like millet, perhaps rye, barley, mothers could cook with that, or oat cereal, or also rice cereal, which is not normally my first choice, but I do introduce it along the line. Definitely iron fortified if they breastfed at the time. But I also focus on variety of fruit and vegetables to really feed the gut. In terms of what's important in the gut, one of our buzzwords is butyrate. It's a short-chain fatty acid. And we believe that, or we know from research studies, that if we have a more diverse diet, we have a more diverse gut microbiome, and therefore we make more butyrate, and therefore we have more immune regulatory cells that prevent the child from having allergies. And one of the foods, or two of the foods actually, that's really known to help with butyrate production is rye and barley, the particular fibers that they contain. So I'm not saying we should just feed babies on just cereal, but there's definitely no reason to be concerned about introducing cereal in the infant's diet. So I'm not sure, Wendy, if you want to go to the next question, and then we can go back to the risk factors.
Sure. So I think the next one is, what is your recommendation on type of milk a baby should drink after 1 year old? In some countries, formula is not recommended, while cow's milk is the usual choice. What are your opinions? So, my opinion on that has varied over the years, but number one, I think we should always remind families you don't need cow's milk to grow a baby. You just don't. I think especially in American culture, there's this hyper focus on milk being sustaining and kind of an equivalent of breast milk or formula. And we certainly know it's not, especially because it's devoid of iron. And I have taken care of many children in my pediatric career who overconsumed cow's milk after a year of age to the detriment. So I think we can always lay that out. There are multiple different, beverages and plant-based milk alternatives too. But that being said, if you are choosing cow's milk, it used to be that we always said from year 1 to 2, we always recommended whole milk because of the fats and cholesterol there and neurocognitive and brain development. And yet the AHA came out within the last 10 years saying, maybe not. With the problem of overweight and obesity, you can even recommend 2% milk from age 12 months forward, especially if the child is consuming animal products and dairy products like cheese and higher fat yogurts. So it's always a combination of how you recommend what milk in the context of what other foods a toddler is eating in that 1 year. But there are, of course, nut milks and other plant-based milks that families can consider. If you do, and Carina, you can talk more about this, but you do typically want the fortified milks when you do that. They typically have a little bit higher fat content and other more complete nutrition like iron fortification.
Yeah, I think, for me, this is an easy answer because I'm a dietitian, but to make that decision at 1 year old, I need to see the child, I need to see the growth chart, I need to see the child's diet. And once I've done all those analysis, I know which milk to best match with the rest of the child's intake. But I do want to highlight again what Wendy said, is that it's not an over-reliance on milk and less of a reliance on food. By 12 months, we want the babies to eat, and they can have some milk in their diet. And interestingly, when I moved here from the United Kingdom, I was surprised about how much milk is allowed in children's diets in the States, where in the UK, we normally restricted to, not restricted, but we would recommend about 12 to perhaps maximum 16 ounces of milk by 12 months of age, trying to get closer to 12 ounces, particularly if they're having yogurt and cheese in their diet too. So, but the milk should match the diet. That's how I work as a dietitian.
Yeah, and I think like all of you out on this call, I mean, it's not every family, unfortunately, who gets to be with a dietitian or nutritionist. So it's, these overarching guidelines, but it is so hard with milk. I think we can just, again, no more than 16 ounces in a typical day is always what we want, so that kids are hungry. I mean, kids just, as we all know, just fill up on milk and then aren't hungry for all that food. And in the whole, in our whole conversation today too, we always want to think about diet diversity, and toddlerhood is just a time of pickiness in general. And so, making sure that kids are hungry for all those other foods is certainly important in the context of milk choice and milk volume. Okay, I think we'll go back to the next one on risk factors, and then we'll just keep integrating your questions here. We still have 20 minutes, so lots more time to get some more of your questions as well. And we'll kind of just get through this risk factors, and then we have guidelines and some baby-led weaning, and then we'll open it up. So I'm just going to go through these a little bit quickly, Carina. Should a parent expect their baby to be allergic to the same food that the parents are allergic to? The answer is no, thank goodness. We know that, the development of food allergies is multifactorial. It's likely a blend of genetic influences and genetic risk factors, and then a blend of just living in a modern society where we have less vitamin D, where we have detergents that break down our skin barrier, where our microbiomes have been, really decreased and limited in some ways because of the industrialized. That being said, a family history of food allergy does increase a child's risk by about a 0.6%, increase. So it's a factor that's not as strong as eczema, again, but it is certainly a factor, and I think even more when a sibling has the diagnosis. But again, helping guide families to know the number one risk factor is eczema, severe eczema, more than thinking about family history. But of course, our genes really do matter in how our immune system reacts. And so when a family does have a family history, they are the ones who stand to benefit the most, like those babies with eczema, to getting all these foods in early life. And I'm going to go just to the next one. Would allergen recommendations be different for children of parents with severe peanut and milk allergies? And yes, the questioner says, they experience this as a barrier, of course. And we already covered that in some ways when we were talking earlier about hives and vomiting being the most common reaction, still being very rare and typically very mild in infancy and toddlerhood. So again, if mom or dad has a serious life-threatening IgE-mediated food allergy, that may be a great candidate if the child has eczema especially, but even so, just to calm families down to potentially do the first introduction in the presence of an allergist. But again, the earlier I believe that those babies get those common foods in and keep them in the diet, the better they'll downregulate their risk of developing a food allergy. And then lastly, I'll go through this one, and then Carina, you can go. But for families with celiac disease, what to do about adding wheat to an infant diet? Will this help protect against celiac? Carina, do you want to take that one?
Yes, I contacted all my gastro colleagues, and nobody is aware of official guidelines about advising against wheat introduction in children where there is celiac disease in the family, although we know that your chances of having celiac disease is increased if you come from a family where that disease exists. When this was studied from an allergy point of view, they found that infants who had wheat introduced between 4 and 6 months, this was the EAT study, there was less celiac disease in the group that had wheat introduced between 4 and 6 months than those that had it introduced after 6 months of age. So I think it's, again, safe to say once the baby is ready to eat, we can have a diverse diet. Wheat can be part of the story, And in the latest studies, it doesn't seem to increase the risk of celiac disease.
Yeah, thank you. Just as a reminder, you know, the mechanism, right, of celiac is very different, of course, than the mechanism of IgE-mediated food allergies. Deals with, you know, IgA and an autoimmune process of those antibodies in the gut lining, which is, of course, how when you're checking for celiac disease, you can do blood surveillance. But again, typically we don't see a lot of celiacs in very early life. You tend to see it later after age 3. I thought we'd take one question from the audience, and then we'll keep going on the next slide on guidelines. But you know, I'd love for Carina, you to answer the question from Helen here. Once a child is diagnosed with an IgE allergy, then does the mother need to cut the allergy out? And I'm assuming that, Helen, you're asking that in the context of breastfeeding.
That is a very complex question to answer, and you will get many different answers. But what I can say is that in terms of IgE-mediated allergy, we very rarely, if ever, see IgE-mediated symptoms triggered through breast milk. It may normally occur when the child gets introduced to milk or to egg or to soy or to wheat. In that case, we only take it out of the child's diet because the child was clearly not symptomatic while mom was eating the allergen and feeding the child. In 5% of cases, we touched on food protein-induced enterocolitis syndrome. In 5% of cases, the child may react to the allergens in mom's breast milk, but we again very, very rarely see that. The only time where we do ask mothers to take milk, particularly sometimes egg and soy, out of their diet, is if the child presents with proctocolitis, which Dr. Swanson already mentioned as well. That's the infants that present with blood in the stool, and they normally outgrow it about 6 months after diagnosis. And that is really the only clear presentation of allergic disease where we can say that the allergen in breast milk is associated with the child's symptoms. Most other presentations of allergic or food allergies, even such as eosinophilic diseases, we do not consider taking the allergen out of mom's diet when she's breastfeeding is beneficial.
Yeah, thank you. And there's someone, I'm going to move on to another question from today with a very generous, please answer this. And I think we did, but I just want to reiterate the question is, if an infant has displayed symptoms, milk protein allergy, so blood in the stool, eczema around the ankles, or frankly, eczema is controversial as a symptom itself, but typically cow's milk protein allergy is seen, you know, with blood in the stool, mucousy stools, and other symptoms. When do you proceed with reintroducing? And as Dr. Venter said, sometimes as early as 3 to 6 months after diagnosis, or certainly around a year of age if it's diagnosed within infancy, we typically return to introducing introducing dairy in that diet. So let's see. So why don't we go through? Go ahead.
Sorry.
Sure.
In proctocolitis, so these babies have non-IgE allergy. We're not concerned about anaphylaxis. They have proctocolitis with blood in the stool. If you search the term milk ladder, it comes up under images. I've published 4 or 5 papers on the topic. It's a very easy way to get milk reintroduced in a child's diet because you literally start with a cookie, a muffin, a pancake, then a bit of yogurt, cheese, and finally milk. So this works beautifully for this particular presentation of cow's milk allergy. Not to be done if you're dealing with IgE-mediated food allergies where you're concerned about anaphylaxis.
Yeah, and again, the symptoms of that are different, right? With hives and vomiting being the most common symptoms within minutes to hours of feeding, which is super different than what we see in those infants with cow's milk intolerance. There's a question here, Carina, that while we're talking about infants and dairy and things, someone asking about the high protein content of Greek yogurt. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And I think what you're doing, you're comparing that to just traditional yogurt. I certainly don't have any concerns about Greek yogurt being incorporated as part of an infant or toddler's diet. Carina, do you have any concerns about that?
I do, just because, you know, really when we look at the protein requirements of infants, it's not that high. And so 3 grams in 1 ounce of yogurt, particularly if they eat, you know, 2 ounces, they can easily get to 6 grams. Could be a concern, but it's all about the bigger picture. my preference is just to use non-Greek yogurt until they get about 1 year of age, or at least until they have a more mixed diet from 9 to 10 months of age. But for the very young ones, I don't give that big amount of protein, just because it then can easily make up a quarter to half of their protein requirements in a day.
I'm so glad you said that. I didn't think of it that way. Thank you. That's great. So I guess the bottom line is, yeah, no Greek yogurt, ideally until 12 months. Use the standard yogurt before that. Yeah, okay, so let's go back. So different guidelines. I think we can quickly go through these, and I think we just have a couple of other questions. If you have any last minute questions, please submit them, and the team that's helping support us with all these questions is putting them in front of us. So just in regards to guidelines, the AAP and WIC recommend not starting solids until 6 months. I get asked, well, if we can't provide baby foods earlier, if their doctor's okay starting solids, is there a reason that the guidelines differ? And I think this is so complicated. Again, depends on the committee from which part of AAP, and I'm sorry about the frustrations and the inconsistencies there, specifically for families who want financial support for those complementary and solid foods. I think a reminder there can be continuing to share family foods if they're having a difficult time getting them and their baby and mom and dad have both showed readiness for those solids. Again, pediatricians across the country so often will encourage and support families with complementary foods between 4 to 6 months of age. And like anything, it's an advocacy issue. And of course, we want all families to have the opportunity towards diet diversity in any way. So if anyone wants to partner or has ideas about partnering with WIC or any data that I think Dr. Venter and I could provide to increase and create both understanding for the benefit of all these complementary allergens, especially in early life, I think we'd be happy to do that. Carina, take the next question about, you're so expert about guidelines from around the world. Do other countries also follow these guidelines? How do they differ around the world, Carina?
Yes, so I'm very fortunate to really be involved in guidelines right across the world, from Australia through Asia, Europe, and here in the United States, northern USA, and as well as Canada. And all the guidelines really now recommend that we can start solids between 4 and 6 months of age. Most of them say around 6 months, not before 4 months. They're very clear that when we do start introducing solids, the diet needs to be diverse. It was particularly highlighted in the North American and Canadian guidelines. And all the guidelines really highlight the importance of getting peanut and egg in, and then follow on with the other allergens.
Yeah, and I think universally the chorus around the world is that delay is risky, not introduction, right? That that everyone around the world, there can be little tweaks here and there, but everyone around the world is encouraging not to delay the introduction of all these different common allergens, but recognizing as well the most data exists for certain couple foods, but the immune system likely does have a universal mechanism of how it learns about food. So we know that diet diversity is extremely beneficial. So, I love looking at the Australian guidelines, Carina. I think that they've been some of the most forward, and they've had really beautiful public health, parent and pediatrician education that I think is just really easy to look at. So if you Google that, you can certainly find the Australian guidelines. They have some beautiful online resources on supporting families.
Yes, it's called NIP, N-I-B, Allergies in the Bub, B-U-B. So a beautiful name, NIP, Allergies in the Bub, has got all that practical information.
Yeah, I think it's just nipthebud.org, right? I think that's the website.
Yeah.
You can find it. It's a great website, though. It's beautiful. The last one here, do you think that the rise in peanut allergies is because parents were not introducing peanuts early? And what about cultures where peanuts are not a normal part of the diet? I'll start with this, and then Carina, I'd love your support. I think that, one of the things that Dr. Kari Nadeau, who runs the Allergy and Immunology Center at Stanford, has really taught me over the years is like, why is it that peanut's such a common allergen? We know it's the most common food allergy in childhood, about 20% of children with food allergies, and why. And because we think that allergies in part develop because of sensitization through the skin, some of the theories really about why peanut is that peanut tends to be a very lipophilic protein, meaning that the protein that talks to the immune system attaches to fat, lipophilic. So it attaches to fat and it becomes really stable in the environment. So if you and I go into a movie theater or a drugstore or a grocery store or a daycare center and there's been peanut there, if you were microscopically go look around it, you'd find more peanut dust than, for example, something like banana. Banana just degrades. There's not a lot of fat in it. The protein doesn't attach to it and it degrades in the environment. So the reason probably that you see more peanut allergies in cultures that have peanut is that it's just in the environment, and then kids who have broken down skin or eczema get exposed through their skin and can be sensitized to that. So to the question's point, I mean, I think it's really important to note, yes, food allergies are all over the world. You know, rates are highest in places like Australia, here in the United States at 8%. Australia has about 10%. Some data around China is about 8 to 10%, but they do vary on which food. So for example, in Italy, where there's a lot more hazelnut, there's a lot more hazelnut allergy in children. That's probably because there's just hazelnut more prevalent in the environment where babies are being raised. So yes, I mean, I think when pediatricians like me back in the year 2000 started telling people not to eat peanut until their baby was 3. I mean, I raised my own children that way. I mean, my first son didn't have any peanut until age 3, and thankfully he didn't develop a peanut allergy. But you know, we did likely contribute to the ongoing escalation of food allergies because we missed out in those years in some ways of getting that introduction. But again, I think it's so multifactorial, from microbiome, vitamin D, overuse of antibiotics, you know, sun, et cetera, and genetics, that it's complicated. But Carina, do you have other things to add to that? I think that was the answer to both of those.
No, but just particularly getting back to the cultures where peanuts are not a normal part of the diet, and it may not be high in prevalence. So when we wrote the European guidelines, that was a particular issue because there's very little peanut allergy in Germany, for example. And so the conclusion and recommendation that we made was that in populations where there's a high prevalence of peanut allergy, the European Academy suggests introducing peanuts in an age-appropriate form as part of complementary feeding. And so, you know, we were basically saying, if it's not a problem in your country and, you know, it's not often included in the early diet, then perhaps there's no need to really get it in at 4 months, but, you know, make it part of your normal cultural eating practices. So that's a really good question.
Yeah, and I think,
then there will be other allergies, you know, like in Asia, for example, there's a lot of shellfish allergies in the very young children. And so their prevention guidelines have been slightly adapted to perhaps prioritize shellfish, but still get peanut, egg, and the other allergens in. I think it's just slightly shifting the emphasis.
Yeah, and I think we also have to think, I mean, right now with the pandemic, it's not so true, but we live in a global world. And I think if you think on it, what would you do for your own child? You know, I mean, you want your child to be able to eat anything they want and travel anywhere in the world and enjoy any kind of cultural food experience. And so in some ways, I don't want to limit our scope. However, there might be different priorities depending on where someone is. So we have about 3 minutes left. Let's quickly, Carina, let's keep it really tight, and then I'll just do a couple closing slides, I think. But just on baby-led weaning, what are your overarching thoughts on food introduction when it comes to baby-led weaning, Carina?
So, you know, there's now many people who prefer to do baby-led weaning. I think the baby-led weaning people and the allergy people need to meet halfway. And I work very closely with a number of the baby-led weaning experts here in the United States, something that I'm really excited about. I think we have some difficulties perhaps with getting the allergens in the very young ones who really cannot hold or chew or mush the food, you know, inside their mouth. So in those cases, perhaps we may want to think about adding some diluted peanut butter or peanut flour to a yogurt of their choice. You know, when they get older, we can do things like, you know, a muffin with peanut flour, egg as well. We're really interested in the egg white. So if we can, you know, sort of like fry the egg and we can cut it in slices and they can actually hold the egg white and chew it, that's a really good way of getting it in. But getting that form of egg white into a 4-month-old is really not going to happen. So I definitely think the baby-led weaning and allergy can meet halfway. I think we just need to think about ways to make it practical for families. I now have a number of mothers who prefer to do baby-led weaning. And if you ever going to go to the American Academy of Allergy meeting, it's the end of February, I give a presentation on baby-led weaning and allergy prevention where two worlds meet. So I'm going to talk about that. So I think it's possible, but I think perhaps the baby-led weaning group needs to meet us a little bit more than halfway to get the allergens in pre-6 months, whereas post-6 months, it's very easy to match our baby-led weaning with allergen introduction. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, I love that, Carina, and I'm going to be at her talk in Phoenix. So quickly, we'll just close. I think lastly, Spoonful One was developed to be really convenient, even in a setting like baby-led weaning, where you could mix up this into any, roll around a banana in a mix-in. Spoonful One is designed by Dr. Carina Venter from research at Stanford. It includes products that just have 16 of the most common allergens. So taking all the most common allergens here in the United States and has small amounts of each one of those foods in kind of every bite. So the goal is just to say, eat all these table foods, keep up bringing these natural, wholesome, homemade foods, but make sure on a daily basis you get exposure at the protein level to all of these different common allergens in early life. And, I think you can certainly visit us. We also, just one call out, we have a program at Spoonful One, and we really love dietitian and nutrition support where families who qualify for WIC or food stamps, we are happy to send those families a year's subscription to Spoonful One. We pay for the product and we pay for the shipping. We don't want families to feel out of reach for common allergen introduction. So please check out spoonfulone.com if you want to enroll any of the families you take care of into this VIP program and can vouch for them from the WIC standing or food stamps, and we will happily send that on the way. But thank you so much for including Dr. Venter and myself in your day, and please reach out. You can find me at Wendy Sue at spoonfulone.com, and certainly Carina, you can find her as well through us, and we can provide any introductions. But thanks so much for listening to us, and keep the conversations going, and thanks for your interest in helping protect babies in early life.
And so we just want to say thanks for joining us, and thanks to Spoonful One.
Bye, everyone. Have a great day.